All right then. POIs in the chat. Very glad for this opportunity to debate against Kagalkar. Starting now. The subcontractors, gig workers, freelancers, they were previously not covered by the official labor protections in South Korea, are just as deserving of representation, rights, and recourse. The Yellow Envelope Act is just one example of countries expanding labor protection to secondary laborers, especially those hired by subsidiaries and contracting companies, extending liability to those companies that ultimately benefits the most from exploiting the vulnerable. On opening government, we're very happy to support this particular law and all laws like it that protect some of the most vulnerable people in society. Just at the top, I also want to flag that the most likely counterfactual is just a world without this law. That is to say, the world before this law was passed, where this kind of liability does not extend so far, and where these kind of gig workers don't get the same kind of protections that they are afforded to under this law. Two arguments. Why do we think this law protects a key demographic underpinning the labor force? And secondly, an argument on liability and why parent companies do deserve to pay for things like this. So who are these subcontractors and gig workers? And I think an important characterization to make at the top is that these are generally people without formal education or higher education. These are people in between jobs, people who need the flexibility of gig workers, like single mothers or like poorer people taking on secondary income, etc. Generally speaking, these are people that don't choose to involve themselves in gig work for long periods of time, for the reason that it's just generally not very pleasant. It doesn't pay as well, there's less security, don't have a lot of health insurance or retrenchment benefits that come with it. And that's why most of the people who involve themselves in gig work are people that do so out of necessity, they basically don't choose to do so as their primary source of income. What this law does is that it protects larger companies from exploiting them. For example, McDonald's contracts delivery services to Grab that then uses their service partners to deliver food to you, right? Which is basically the food delivery drivers. If the customer rates the delivery driver poorly, if the weather is inclement, or maybe for some reason they drop your food or were a little bit slow and the customer punishes them for it, at most, maybe Grab gives them small compensation. McDonald's does not suffer any repercussion or consequence whatsoever, but still takes the entire profit from the fees that is charged from delivering that particular food. And this is likely to continue in a myriad of other different ways because the profit incentive often leads to companies exploiting workers and cutting costs wherever they can. This looks like Amazon warehouse workers that were forced to pee in cups, right, in order to meet quotas and very tough delivery times. It looks like this race to the bottom where you also have other companies trying to exploit to get cheap labor. So you now have Foodpanda delivery competing with Grab delivery, all of them wanting to get the large chains like McDonald's or Domino's to give the tenders to them to hire them, which also leads to them depressing the cost of the tender and further depressing the wages and ultimate benefits that paid to a worker at the end of the day. So especially among subcontractors begging for tenders from larger companies, this is where competition is the fiercest. And the final reason this holds true is because gig workers often don't have a lot of other choice but to accept these conditions. You can lodge a complaint, maybe you can complain about it on social media, but because these companies are so large with such a strong financial base, and because you as a worker don't have a lot of capital, financial power to sue them in court, there isn't even a law that allows you to do that. It makes it very difficult for you to find any kind of recourse, and you're dependent on this source of income. The impact of this is that we get protection for these gig workers, which are of tremendous importance to the economy and to the government. One, because it's just a principled right to get protection from exploitation, and insofar as we prove these companies are exploited and this law protects them, that is enough for OG to win the round. But more than that, we think that these people rely on gig work and income to sustain their lives, especially during downturns and recessions, right? So it's important to protect them because this is income that sustains them. But finally, allowing gig work to grow their income and achieve a degree of financial stability, once they're not burnt out from working 3 different jobs, they can start to rethink their career path. Maybe they want to go back to school because they have a bit of financial cushion. They eventually want to take on a higher value position. So this protection of gig workers and protecting their financial stability actually goes back to protecting them at the end of actually goes back to helping boost the economy at the end of the day. The final thing is that gig work, for its flexibility and benefits, is still a choice that some people would choose to opt for, and increased labor protections means that you're likely to get more people opt into gig work because they see this as a viable option and not a second-class option. Is there anything from CEO?
Yes, so why would a gig worker pay $5,000 or more to go to court to sue over maybe not getting $500 since they aren't unionized?
I mean, the law allows you to unionize and to collectivize, right? I think, yeah, the law allows you to do that. So one of the ways that these gig workers can find recourse is to basically collectivize and form a union to then sue the company. In terms of cost, probably with the gig workers, maybe it won't be that expensive. But the fact that they're able to collectivize and provide the evidence means that there are law firms that are willing to do this pro bono or to, personal incentive to take down the big corporations. All of these things are more likely to happen as a consequence of the law existing. Second claim, why do you think the parent companies or entities that are hiring subcontractors deserve liability over the working conditions of gig workers? This is an argument on principle that demonstrates that the large companies were previously shielded from hiring, from the exploitation that goes down at the bottom, are in fact primarily responsible for furthering these forms of exploitation. And the reason is because these large companies often use contractors while knowing about the conditions that they work in. They are complicit in the harm that is being done while reaping massive profits for their labor because the prices that they charge consumers are the same, but the cost they try to depress it as much as possible. This looks like companies outsourcing call centers or packaging services, etc. They don't hire their own workers because they need to pay them, often have to pay them a bit more. You hire subcontractors because you don't have to pay EPF and insurance and other kinds of health benefits. We will argue that companies are responsible for two key reasons. The first is that they have a responsibility to protect the rights of their workers, to pay them adequately, to provide their health insurance, etc., because of the work and the time that workers are investing in their time into building up the company. Companies have a reciprocal duty to protect them and to give them these kinds of fair wages and fair benefits that needs to be enforced by the law because workers often have a power asymmetry as compared to the company. We think this duty ought to extend across the supply chain, not just to your direct workers, but also to other workers who are contributing towards the profits that you as a company are making. An example for this we already see, Top Glove in Malaysia that was fined by the US for using migrant labor without protection. The courts found that willful ignorance of exploitation was sufficient to prove liability, and I think that this law just advances that. We're very happy to see it continue. Second reason is because they're benefiting directly from exploitation to third-party actors, etc. It looks like Purdue Pharmaceutical that was found to be complicit in the opioid addiction because they pushed out a lot of drugs, and even though they tried to pretend that it wasn't their responsibility, they were aware of the harms that were being propagated as a consequence. You look at BP, like the Deepwater Horizon, right, that spilled oil and destroyed 75% of marine life in the Gulf of Mexico. These companies had a duty of care. These companies are benefiting of the cost-cutting measures and therefore must be held responsible for the kind of exploitation that they push out as a consequence. These companies have the responsibility to find out through things like ESG disclosures, to things like investigation, and they need to choose to do business with responsible SMEs. They don't engage in these kinds of exploitation. They are liable, and as a consequence, they're also less likely to engage in these kinds of bad behaviors. We're very proud to propose.
Thanking the Prime Minister for that speech, calling upon the Leader of Opposition.
Hi, I want to check that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
All right. My speech in 3, 2, 1. The opening government has given to you is a wouldn't it be nice case. Although they do prove the idea that it's nice to be legally protected, they are unable to fulfill this burden insofar as they have not explained to you why this is something which is likely to be effective or why these larger companies are ever going to sway. What we're going to argue to you is why this yellow envelope actually strategically disincentivizes individuals from unionizing, and in the instance that they do, it screws them over even further. We believe that the comparative would be way better. I'm going to start with a bit of framing. I want to note that the success of employees in labor rights is dependent on the size of the power disparity between them and their employer. We believe that the Yellow Envelope Act widens this disparity, forcing employees to fight against the parent company rather than their direct employer. Note that status quo is better for accessibility in labor rights. It is inherently easier to argue against your factory contractor rather than Amazon itself, and this is especially considering the current labor laws, which sufficiently deter union busting. We see that individuals are much more likely to access benefits in our world. First, with illustrations, what does government's world really look like? Because this is something which is missing a lot from TJ's speech, right? We believe that this is something which consolidates power at the top. It means that from the localized version that we have in the status quo is going to be top down, increases the power of the parent company to control employee movement, and expands the definition of the employer towards that parent company, meaning that disputes are no longer between you and your local managers. It's going to be you versus Tesco Incorporated International. Who are these parent companies? Most times they are massive MNCs such as your Amazons, your Samsungs, your Unilevers. These are all, given that all companies are owned by like 7 companies in total in the world, we say that the disparity becomes so much bigger. No, these companies are massively rich and experienced. They can afford the best litigation and lawyers. They're insanely profit-minded to the point where they also lack proximity to the actual employees on the ground. What does our then look like? We're going to be defending status quo, in which labor disputes are localized. This means that chain of like who you talk to. It's first your managers, second your district managers, third your national level, and then lastly your parent. No, that stage 3 and 4 of national level company and parent company almost never happen in status quo. You're usually able to settle most disputes with the managers or the district management. We say that in government's world, you force them to be engaged with because you skip the first 2 steps. No, that the disputes happen in the form of one, discussions in the office in our ward. In the worst case scenario, it's going to be short-term strikes or even civil disputes, which are often smaller and cheaper because of the type of people that you're going against. Who then engages in either mechanism in either ward, and therefore is the most important actor that we need to discuss. It looks like these poorer individuals who need their jobs, who are forced to work these less attractive jobs such as floor workers at supermarkets or factory workers, so on and so forth. And these are people who can probably only really mobilize in smaller scales. First argument then, directly engaging with opening government, how the Yellow Envelope Act strategically disadvantages workers. First, know that it increases the power disparity between the employee and who they must fight in order to get labor rights. And I want to visualize this to you real quick. First, note that you probably already have the knowledge that they're so much richer than you and can afford the best lawyers against you, and they probably have a team dedicated to it anyways, as we've seen in the past. But second, when you are unionizing against someone and you want to discuss those terms, this is a physical meeting in which you must sit with that particular individual, with this board of directors in front of you to discuss this. We say that this is something which is intimidating. We say that this is something which is going to force these labor workers to sway towards the demands of their employer. Even if that discussion happens, even if no literal union busting does actually happen, we say these unions are likely to be demotivated and less stable in general. But second, when you are engaging with the parent company, these are companies which are less proximate but also very profit-minded, which means they're less likely to have empathy towards the workers on the ground. In fact, they're likely to be very disconnected from the struggles that you have on the ground. They're probably unaware of the fact that you have to take 5 buses just to go to work. They probably see this reality as an exaggeration. But second, they have a great capacity to legally fight against you and your rights and win it very, very well. But lastly, note that the Yellow Envelope Act actually emboldens these parent companies to further restrict your benefits because you put the problems on their table now, and it also increases the cost onto them since they're expected to take care of everyone, meaning that even in the instance that you're able to get some change, it's probably going to result in things such as mass layoffs for the sake of decreasing costs. What does this mean? It means that what does this mean in terms of impacts? It means that one, you're just less likely to unionize in general because the power asymmetry is just so much higher. But second, in the instance where you are able to successfully unionize, it's going to result in so many other people losing their jobs because the company wants to cut costs. Second argument then is going to be the positive as to why status quo, or in other words, our counterfactual is so much more of a secure path to victory for worker rights. Before I continue, sure, I'll take that to your eye.
A lot of this ignores that parent companies are usually overseeing like hundreds of unions. So why would each union be scared? Because it's not one union versus Samsung. It's like 20 versus Samsung.
Okay, like I said, first of all, you're probably going to end up losing a lot of people or losing a lot of jobs because the parent company wants to save save costs. But secondly, note that these particular labor unions, even if they're overseeing so much, the type that succeed are the types which are willing to concede because of the nature of these parent companies not being that proximate and being profit-minded. And in fact, this allows them to offset accountability because insofar as they are willing to concede to the weakest unions or the unions with the least demands, they are able to say that they've done enough, and it enables them and validates them in shutting down the ones who need more help. Second argument on why status quo is a much more secure path to victory for worker rights. Note that first, it significantly reduces the power disparity between the laborer and the person that they need to fight with. It is so much easier to talk to a direct contractor, your manager, your district manager, individuals which are proximate to you, and request for these rights or request for certain benefits rather than in government's ward. But second, know that local management is typically more empathetic in general. These are individuals which are paid less, who have lesser benefits, and will also benefit from any changes that they are able to help you push for. But second, these are individuals which are just more proximate to you, who are able to see you working on the ground every day, who are more likely to have leniency in giving you leeway to things such as time off, emergency leave, leaving early, so on and so forth. Things which may be small, but so many workers benefit from this slight leniency because of the fact that they have 6 children to take care of at home, because of the fact that they need to go rush towards their other job. But third, know that it's just more accessible to the poorest individuals, especially these gig workers that opening government wants to go on and on about. Know that these are people who are often paid less due to the instability of the pay. Given that gig is more volatile, we say that the affordability of legal representation against your local tender is just so much much better. But also that pro bono is actually more likely to come in our ward because these lawyers actually believe that they have a fighting chance at actually having some sort of returns. But fourth, note that local tenders are just more fragile in general. Losing workers to strikes and unions hurts a lot more to your local factory than it does to your parent company of Amazon, which means the likelihood of you suing is a lot higher. In the comparative, government offsets this responsibility to the parent company, meaning that these smaller people who are the most likely people to sway are more like now can just not sway. Impact stat. Know that one, unionizing is just more accessible and less scary. But second, you are more attracted to poor pro bono lawyers. Third, change is actually more likely to happen, even if it's limited. We see that still a change that would never happen in government's ward. We win the debate. Thank you.
Thanking the Leader of Opposition for that speech. Deputy Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Hi, yeah, just checking that I'm audible because round one, my line was really bad.
Yep, you are.
Okay, cool. So when Eugenes were sued by Hype over mismanagement, or defamation, the result wasn't one that protected the workers. It was one where Min Hee-jin was demoted and the individual members were sued over breach of contract, even when they had clear evidence of mismanagement. The unfortunate reality is that disproportionate power is held by corporations, even over courts, even over subsidiary companies, because oftentimes they are amorphous structures that hide behind liability. I think it's for those reasons that you couldn't buy OO's case, and you had to believe what TJ explained to you. Because the win condition for OG is very simple. The point at which we prove is far easier to hold parent companies accountable. It's far harder for them to escape accountability, and how we lead to more accountability in the future. That's when we're very easily able to win this debate. I want to firstly deal with what OO tells us, because OO tries to argue then that there exists a power disparity which makes it far harder for individuals to enter disputes. A few responses here. The first is that this ignores the barriers towards accountability in the first place, right? Because it's more than just the leaving early or the fact that you need more, I don't know, maternal like pay or something. It is the fact that oftentimes the parent companies lead to you losing your job, but are still able to get away with it because it's not a direct robbery of your rights, right? So it's things like restructuring in order to make sure like they need more workers in this one area and therefore are able to lay off a bunch of workers in this other area. It's things like outsourcing, which means you need less labor. It's things like mergers that means that you also need less workers because you just rely on other companies or you rely on like, economies of scale, right? These are the kinds of ways that parent companies are able to steal jobs from the workers and steal money from the workers without actually being held accountable because it's not a subsidiary company, right? They're just following the orders of a larger corporation. And these are the things that aren't accounted for on opposition side of the house. It's far harder for you to hold these parent companies accountable because you only want to go to your direct employer. You only want to go to your factory manager, which means far harder for you to talk about being laid off, the point at which you don't have the expansions of these protections, which means on our side of the house, we're able to break this barrier of accountability in the first place because we hold the most potent individuals accountable. But the second response is that even if you do sue the parent company on our side of the house, you probably have to go to the subcontractor first, right? Because they sue them for, like taking away your job or like giving you that letter of letter of like firing you, right? Which means that you've likely sue the subcontractor first, and then they can escalate by including more defendants, by including the parent company later on, right? They probably don't want to do this, by the way, because they don't want to be on the hook, right? So likely they have incentives to deal with this as fast as possible. The difference is when this was a matter that was far larger than just the subcontractor, that's when we were able to hold them accountable, because now it's far easier to see through the veil. But also note on the comparative why it's far harder on their side of the house, because when you want to hold a company accountable, it's amorphous, because they're just a subsidiary company. They're not the ones who are managing the decisions. And likely the resources are going to be the same for litigation anyways, because they're still funded by the parent company, right? It's likely that you're going to have funds for, legal protections, and you're just going to have the same level of resources for litigation, which likely means on either side of the house, whether or not you're able to hold these subcontractors accountable is going to be the same. The difference is where you're able to target and when you're able to gain that kind of support, which leads to the last response as well on why strikes and unionization will likely still occur. In fact, even probably to a larger extent, because if you look at the John Deere protest or the Hollywood artist strike, these are points at which people are willing to take losses, wait them out, and use public pressure to actually hold these companies accountable, because they understand that there is a problem here, right? There is a sapping of their rights. There is a, loss of their dignity. They want to hold these companies accountable because they know they deserve to be paid more. The point at which then you're able to expand protections for these individuals is when you're likely going to get far more strikes and far more unionization and far more protections for these individuals, right? The point at which the company no longer has low conditions to have limiting claims on damages, for example, or when you aren't being held disproportionately accountable when you lose a strike. That's the point at which people are more confident in, leading to a strike in the first place, or leading to fighting for their rights in the first place. Because oftentimes the barriers, as conceded by both sides of the house, is the fact that you're quite poor, so you cannot afford to take a day off of work, right? Because you're not protected. This means that in South Korea, with the Yellow Envelope Act, this allows you to take that step forward in order to have your rights, in order to protect the most vulnerable individuals, right? But also note how corporations probably don't like litigation because you have to spend a lot of money, which likely means that if you have a large amount of individuals all unionizing at the same time against a parent company, this is far more likely. But extensively as well, why are we able to get larger protests? And this largely just because the parent company now is a big individual structure, right? So instead of being an individual targeting the subsidiary company, you talk with other people who are sharing common problems with this parent company. You unionize with larger amounts of people to hold the parent company accountable because you see it as a structural, larger issue. The end outcome here is very, very simple. On weighing, we're best able to protect the most vulnerable because these are the individuals who are suffering because of invisible actions by parent companies. These are the individuals who cannot afford to put food on the table, who cannot afford to send their children to school because they're laid off willy-nilly by these parent companies who are no longer held accountable. That's what we change on OG. That's why we protect people more. Before I go on, I'll take a point from closing.
So the debate seems to be about outsourcing when the info side actually talks about three different things. In the status quo, let's talk about the third one. In the status quo, why can companies sue unions that go on strike sometimes?
So they can, but the issue is that we need to protect them more, right? Because oftentimes when you sue people after having a strike, it's disproportionate because the company now has more power, and so they're able to hold these workers accountable for going on strike. That's why we need more protections, right? That's why we need to stop them from suing them for so much financial damages, or prevent them from doing as much damage, because these are the most vulnerable individuals, right? Even if we concede the fact that maybe sometimes it's okay for you to sue these unions or sue these individuals, the issue is that these are still the most vulnerable individuals, right? These are the people who need the money most compared to these corporations that probably don't need the money as much. So as long as we're able to put food on the table for these people, I think that's fine. But why is it okay even if the problems that arise are not big and these strikes are irrelevant? I think two reasons. The first is just because of epistemic access, right? I think these individuals know what is important to them. I think you need to recognize them and recognize that and give them that autonomy to choose. But the second thing is that when you give individuals more choice and more accountability, that's when you have higher productivity, right? Because they know they can hold the company accountable. They're more willing to work because they know they're not being exploited, or even if they are, they can hold the company accountable. These are the various reasons as to why having this form of accountability is good, not just for the workers individually, but as a larger economy, because the workers are part of the economy and because that creates a better society.
Thanking the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, calling upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this OG case is ultimately contingent on small individuals, if not small unions, actually being able to take down all of these big corporations like the actual parent companies. I'm just going to illustrate to you exactly why they haven't proven that. But moreover, I'm just going to frame up our case, which explains why that question will obviously never be answered, which is like the yellow envelope really just encourages corporations to consolidate power at the very top. And what does this really mean, like practically, right? This means that, at a local level, you're not going to be suing that local factory, which is a subcontractor, or your managers, which are part of that subcontractor. But instead, you're going to be suing the whole of Amazon or the whole of Samsung. We explained very clearly in Atifa's case exactly why this is bad. First, and the biggest one is really just that they're going to have comparatively more capital to beat you in absolutely anything. So if it really was discussions in unions, they would be able to crack down on you a lot harder than your subcontractor. If it really was actual local cases, then they would obviously be able to deal with you a lot more better because they have billions, if not trillions of dollars worth more in legal teams which are able to crack down, look for legal loopholes, as well as deal with you in a lot more quicker of a manner. And then the outcome is relatively simple, just like none of the recourse which they argued in OG will ever manifest, by the way. And I encourage you to look at your notes. There's really no path to victory as it pertains to any of these individuals being able to deal with any of the companies. The best case scenario is maybe they are brave enough to bring them to court and then they lose them after losing $10 million, and then they also have to pay for the legal fees of this parent company because they end up winning. But second, that you often deter legal cases on a local level, where in the comparative, you would look at your subcontractor, not that big of a company, usually local companies, and you'd want to obviously take them to court because you have a chance at winning. The legal fraternity around you explains that you probably have a decent chance at winning this case. The problem with their side of the world is when you actually have to pick up arms against Samsung, you probably deter a bunch of legal houses on the ground from actually picking that up. Atifa explains why we're probably going to get recourse on our side for several different reasons. First, and obviously just the flip is, we have a lot less capital. Eitan says that, parent companies also pay for the legal fees of these subcontractors. That's just untrue. That's not profitable. And moreover, that's usually a reason why they shift this liability risk in the very first place, right? But moreover, this debate literally wouldn't happen if not for this. So obviously that's not the framing. Second, that unions can deal with these smaller companies a lot more better when they literally don't have that much capital, nor a perverse incentive so much to the degree that they will literally crack down on you. Atifa's case explains why. There will always be a way to actually deal with all of these unions. But when you have all of these different local subcontractors never actually consolidate together and deal with these actual unions, then it becomes a lot more easier. Whereas if you actually have these giant parent companies continue to crack down on you in a very consolidated, focused, and moreover, very money intensive way, then they're going to be able to deal with you better. But third, just the perception again. Atifa explains very clearly why this perception is really important. Before that, I'll just allow OG to clarify everything.
Yeah, so why would a large company risk millions in funds and reputational damages to fight a lawsuit when it is often cheaper and easier to just pay your contractors a little bit more?
Yeah, no, so that's ridiculous. It's because they don't risk their reputation. It wasn't us. It was the subcontractor. They don't lose profits. It wasn't us. It's the subcontractor. And within the subcontractor's contracts, they have all of that risk and liability put on those individuals. So you don't actually lose any reputation as Samsung. You literally just say, that's such a dumb subcontractor. We'll move on. Which is a reason why we probably improve why you make liability on your side worse, right? So, that just doesn't make sense. And it's ultimately contingent on a very uncharitable and unrealistic framing of how these subcontractors actually contract with real contractors. Their case is just out of this debate very clearly. Let's deal with the two arguments which came out of their side. First is, there's just no protection for gig workers. The first thing I want to acknowledge here is this is just a very limited frame. Even if you really were to buy this, any other house can literally weigh this out on magnitude insofar as we don't try to claim gig workers, like workers in general. If you believe me and Atifa's case, then a lot of regular workers wouldn't be able to access any of this meaningful legal recourse, which means even if they do protect these gig workers, we ultimately weigh them out because every other worker makes a lot more money for the GDP and all of those harms exacerbate a lot worse. But then, why is it untrue that why is it untrue that their argument is just like legit, right? Like, and the simple argument here is just like there's plenty of methods to actually achieve recourse for gig workers in status quo. First is like most trivially, there literally are laws in Korea which actually allow gig workers to find legal recourse. This means you are in fact able to bring all of your, say, like employers, even under a gig, to court if they have done something wrong to you. Even if these are short-term contracts, these are still contracts which are black and white, which allow for you to actually bring these employees to work. Even if these were oral agreements, by the way, which most of them aren't. The examples and language they use were things like Grab and all of these delivery payments, which do have relatively black and white contract detailed terms, right? Then you're still able to bring these people to court. Our case explains why it's relatively easy to deal with these people because they don't have that big of a legal team. Second, that there are also tribunals. So even if this was the oral agreements and no black and white term contracts, which they probably would have won on, then this would still allow for this recourse to occur broadly. Second, that their big companies have a duty of care and there's a principal obligation upon them to, uptake some risk because they have so much money in return. First is obviously most trivial as well. Like if this was that big, as they explained, like BHP spilling a bunch of oil, then they obviously would be removing the corporate veil and bringing in these big companies in. That's why you're probably also going to be able to hold these individuals accountable. If you read the info slide, the delta really isn't about all of these really big lawsuits. It's probably about more local level things. But even if that was wrong and you just don't buy the whole, removing the corporate veil, why is it worse to attempt to hold the parent companies liable? It's just because they're just legally stronger. So this means if you actually have to fight BHP as opposed to just the BHP subcontractor, you're going to have to fight billions of dollars worth of elite legal teams who would probably be able to deal with the company a lot better for all of the reasons that they have much more better actual individuals who are from the law. Second, that they usually have a lot of lobbying powers. So in the process of this, like BHP usually comes free because they make a vast majority of your GDP and therefore you're unable to hold them accountable. Whereas on the comparative, you just have to deal with some subcontractor. But moreover, that this probably means that you won't be at the end of this being able to hold them accountable. And it ultimately just flips. The last extension here, which is really sort of just like a frame up of the case, is just like why company policy becomes a lot more oppressive. The thesis of this argument is that when big companies are aware that they could be vulnerable to lawsuits, they usually crack down on individuals harder. That means that the way these employee contracts form becomes a lot worse, and your capacity to access legal treatment after becomes harder because it is black and white that you can't do certain things. That certain things are of NDA status and cannot be discussed in court. B, that these company policies will become worse. The argument is simple. When this liability is shifted onto the parent companies, they consolidate all of their funds around making all of your contracts harder. That's why our case is, relatively certain, but moreover, just true.
Thanking the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech, calling upon the Member of CAP, when we get ready.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, just give me a second and I'll start. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to do 3 things with this speech. Firstly, to clarify the timeline that this debate exists in. The second, as to where we're able to get more cases to begin with, which is the key to unlocking a lot of the benefits that opening government proposes. And thirdly, as to why the Yellow Envelope Act is likely to work to begin with. On the first, on the timeline, I want to note that this is something that's going to happen within the next 6 months, that this is not something that has been implemented yet. This means 3 things. That one, the labor movement can adapt to this by consulting how the law will be implemented and holding leaders accountable. The second is just that corporations historically that are good to workers can also position them as competitive figures. This makes it far better for them. But thirdly, we think that there's also an ability by bad corporations that will allow them to preemptively shift away from bad labor practices so that they don't get sued as when the fact of implementation happens. This means that there's often still a lot of time to remove a lot of the worst harms that might happen. This means that we're also able to incentivize better behaviors without an immediate cost, and just proves that overall the transition will be good and it's not likely to lead to shocks in the market or within the companies itself. That being said, I want to go straight into argumentation. On the first, where are we able to get more cases? I think the way that we want to prove this is to just prove that we're far more able to protect the most vulnerable workers and empower them to speak out on bad labor conditions. On opening government, we get an explanation that this is one, principally good, and that secondly, that state intervention is just generally good for those contributing to the economy, such as gig workers. Opposition asks, then, why will workers sue? The CJ extension that we want to provide is just to prove that workers are more likely to bring labor disputes to court in the first place, which is prior to a lot of the benefits that they initially give. I want to note a couple of things as to what status quo looks like, given that this is still generally unclear by this point of the debate. The first is just that workers are unprotected right now. Insofar as the Yellow Envelope Act is what allows them to, for example, not be sued to begin with, we think that oftentimes there's a huge ability by corporations who want to get back towards workers or labor unions that have brought cases to try to sue them for huge damages, even though there's something that they can still generally absorb. The second reason as to why status quo is also harmful then is that oftentimes individuals are also forced to sue individuals or groups that are far more proximate to them. And this is incredibly discouraging insofar as they aren't really able to acknowledge as to who it was that led to those conditions that made them behave in those perverse ways to begin with. We think that this generally just means that you create a culture of fear and disincentivize workers from actually reporting in the first place on-side opposition. I want to note that this is also able to flip a lot of opening opposition's case. Their argument on status quo being better is just wrong insofar as what proximity is likely to lead to greater harms at this point in the debate. I want to note that on their side, they say that you can instead do things such as talk to managers, that you can sue lower contractors. I think in terms of their argument on being able to talk to managers, it's just the fact that if they wanted to change these things to begin with, they would have already done so at the point in time where they noticed that there is some form of suffering. But in terms of other things, such as also that of contractors, I want to note that the reason as to why contractors are likely to behave in perverse ways is because of the ordering of parent companies above them, and that's why you need to go up the chain. I think the reason then as to why this is overall just discouraging is because oftentimes when you have a personal relationship with people that you are working closely with, you want to be able to make sure that they're in a better place. You don't want to go against them insofar as you also know that they're also behaving under a lot of other systems, meaning that you aren't really able to fix a lot of problems that you deal with. I want to note that we fix this on our side through, one, ensuring that workers are just able to sue without fear of repercussions. In the first place, we think that corporations have a greater ability to absorb damages, meaning at the point in time where they make millions, oftentimes this was used for intimidation tactics. We solved this problem. But secondly, we also allow workers to go directly to what exactly it is that's causing their labor abuses to begin with. So for example, we want to note that small company managers are not what create the conditions of your working environment. They're more likely just listen to orders from the top. We think that we're more able to fix this at the point in time where you actually destroy what it is that the top is at fault with, meaning that we're more able to do this through what we explain. But even if managers then are the issue, we want to note that one, the comparative that they provide isn't exclusive. You can still do this on either side. But secondly, what we want to do is to just provide you the option to begin with. The impacts are quite simple, right? Not one, more workers are able to bring cases to court, which is just a unique benefit. It's not just necessarily because of barriers, but also because of their own internal incentives and the relationships that they have with people. But secondly, even if they don't win within these court cases, which is a large bulk of the harms that opposition poses, I want to note that experience itself of actually bringing these cases is incredibly cathartic. The ability to hurt is what allows them to have validation for all of the abuses that they've gone through. In the long run, we think that this is also what creates better change. Insofar as one, you're able to get better media coverage, which they aren't able to contend with. But secondly, we're able to shift the Overton window. This weighs over opening opposition insofar as it's an outcome independent part of this debate. But secondly then, why do we generally think that this is likely to work despite the bevy of harms that they propose? I want to clear this up from the top of the speech. The law broadens the scope of coverage, right? There's nothing about forcing you to sue your parent company, meaning that if it is truly the subcontractor that is at fault, we think that you still have the ability to sue the subcontractor. We think that it's on their side where they note that you have to go against increasingly large companies where they actually have to prove that there is some mechanism of pressure that makes it so that you are going to always have to go against them based on what your union says. We don't think that's the context that you have to deal with. I think this immediately takes out opening opposition. I want to then explain the specific context of South Korea. There are three things that we need to note as to why the Yellow Envelope Act existed in that way to begin with. The first is just that there's a lot of current unrest with existing labor landscape, meaning that disputes are often explosive. They don't really have an ability to forward in a way that is actually constructive. The second is that South Korea is also overrun by chaebols right now, which are large family-owned monopolies like Samsung. But thirdly, it's also very hierarchical. There's a top-down structure, which means that managers are often listened to. They don't really know who it is that's at making these decisions, and you just listen blindly. We think that the problems then that exist are that only a few companies are responsible for most of the abuses present today. This means that oftentimes these companies use loopholes to escape a lot of accountability. We think that happens in two ways. That one, oftentimes they frame contractors, but secondly, they also typically blame individuals very far down the ladder because that is something that they currently have the ability to do without any recourse from workers. We think that in general, this just generally proves that blame is pushed away. Even if there is an ability by workers to win those smaller cases on-site op, I don't think they prove as to why that's likely to lead to large-scale change. Why are we better on-site CG then? The first is just that we have a far clearer relationship as to who it is that is implementing a lot of these labor laws with the expansion of definition. We think that when the law specifies who is at fault, or rather who can be viewed as at fault, it means that oftentimes there's a lot less loopholes that they can go through. This means that oftentimes there's going to be far less they're going to be far more preventive. Just on our side, I want to note that the option to sue is an a priori good. Even if there is no access for individual workers, we think it's still good insofar as that right exists. But secondly, we think that there are also a lot more incentives to be preventive through the creation of more clear and ethical processes with outsourcing, changing suppliers, union appeasement, etc. Outside of the financial incentive, this is often also done in order to be able to preserve the reputation. We think that it's more likely to be blown up at the point where the media can point to a specific law that says this is bad behavior as opposed to pointing it out as typical country norms. How does this interact with a lot of opposition case then? Firstly, we just clarify that this is going to be a tool in the toolbox, but secondly, we just say that this optionality is great regardless of any outcome that exists.
Thanking the member of government for that speech. Calling upon the member of opposition whenever you're ready.
All right, hi everyone. If you actually read the info slide, the Yellow Envelope Act includes not only a increased responsibility on the parent company, but also the expansion of all legitimate labor disputes to include mergers and acquisitions and outsourcing, meaning that unions can sue and strike over these things as well as what they've already been suing and striking over, as well as the formal removal of all legal limits on strikes. Insofar as we feel the failure of every other team in this round to actually answer the motion, we clearly take a first. I will deliver a very simple extension about why this massively decreases the amount of mergers and acquisitions and outsourcing, and why that is terrible for South Korea's economy and their firms and workers as well. Firstly then, on just explaining that mergers and acquisitions and outsourcing are absolutely critical. Firstly, mergers and acquisitions. Note, being able to merge in South Korea, so buying over small startup firms and even merging large firms, is absolutely critical because of reasons that were actually already identified in CG. That South Korea's economy traditionally relies upon chaebols to have the economies of scale necessary to compete with other firms elsewhere. Note, South Korea's industries right now primarily, and the most competitive South Korean industries right now are in the tech sector. The tech sector uniquely has, number one, strong network effects, meaning that it's extremely useful to be able to access the data and research of other companies and other researchers, but also has high R&D costs, which means that firms have to have economies of scale to be able to afford these high R&D costs. This then means that large firms need to be large in order to compete in the international sphere. And to be clear, it isn't just about monopolies in Korea. Samsung's main competitors are not Korean firms. It is overseas firms, for example, like Huawei, as well as like Nvidia, as well as the production of semiconductors by TSMC. Crucially, these are all firms in countries without this law, which can freely merge and purchase startup companies, which are able to then leverage economies of scale. This means then that the inability to do these things and merge and conduct mergers and acquisitions necessarily means that South Korea's economy is far less competitive. What does this mean? This means that you are less innovative, less capable of producing new products, less capable of keeping price down, less capable of catering consumers. All of this therefore means that these firms will just have much less economic growth. You will have these firms lag and fail, the point at which you're not able to do all of these things which are absolutely necessary for survivability. Secondly, outsourcing is also critical, right? To be clear, outsourcing creates jobs. This is because oftentimes the way South Korea in particular outsources is by offshoring its production processes to developing countries like Vietnam, which absolutely need these jobs in order to economically grow, because these firms moving over brings knowledge, talent, as well as economic opportunities, as well as currency and capital that just circulates in the local economy. This is critical. But in the majority of cases, the individuals who actually come over and take these jobs are oftentimes foreigners who then are able to get massive increases in skills, massive increases in capital by just moving over to a more advanced economy with a stronger currency, etc. This is critical to be able to uplift these individuals out of poverty. But secondly, it is also important for competitiveness, right? Being able to outsource means you can keep your wages down. And I agree this sounds sad, but being able to keep your wages down means you keep your production processes cheaper, which is critical to attract investors in your sector as well as customers, because these are individuals who will pull out the point at which your costs go up. Therefore, mergers and acquisitions and outsourcing are both absolutely critical. The second part of this argument will then explain why the Yellow Envelope Act massively decreases these things. Number one, trivially, this just includes these things as part of labor disputes, meaning the fact that you can be sued and can meet strikes on the basis of these things means that it's far harder for you to do these things safely. But number two, workers will often just demand too much for three reasons. Number one, they just lack knowledge about whether or not doing mergers and acquisitions are truly a last resort or not. They just are not privy to the backdoor meetings of shareholders and boards of directors. But number two, they oftentimes don't trust management because the incentive of management is always to say that it is a last resort. That's how labor lawyers always talk when negotiating with workers, which then means that even if it is a last resort, even if it is absolutely necessary to keep the competitiveness of your company afloat, the point in which your labor lawyers tell the truth to your workers, they don't trust them because there is just this lack of trust, because they believe that they're always lying and always trying to screw over employees, even if they absolutely need to do this in order to remain afloat. Thirdly, they're psychologically emboldened by the Yellow Envelope Project and Yellow Envelope Act. And that's why it's so important that a POI Eitan that question. Because once you have the Yellow Envelope Act, remove all legal repercussions from striking, including things like having a cool-down period between negotiations and strike, including legally just telling your employer, we're going on strike, here are conditions. Once you remove all of these requirements, this psychologically emboldens workers to demand more and go on strike even when the necessary negotiations have not been done. Importantly, any increase in risk is absolutely critical to preventing further M&As. This is because M&As are expensive. They cost money to do due diligence and do research about other firms. It costs money to hire expensive corporate lawyers to do complex legal documents, which then lay out the terms and conditions of M&As, hiring people like Redo, for example, who will just be working in corporate law in the future and earning millions of dollars a year. All of these are just things that are extremely expensive. Critically, firms don't want to invest money in these things if there's any possibility at all that during this process, all of this money goes out the window, the point in which workers strike, the point in which workers sue, and they might win. All of this risk is just intolerable to firms, which then are far, far more picky when it comes to M&As, even at expense of their competitiveness. But lastly, it also means that the cost of outsourcing is inherently higher. Sure.
Yeah, so it is costly for workers to sue companies, and they tend not to do so unless they're truly suffering. Wouldn't this law be a greater incentive for companies to improve conditions for reasons of scale and competitiveness?
So absolutely not, because improving conditions often comes at the trade-off of competitiveness and scale, but also workers are perfectly comfortable suing companies even if they just want more money and want more resources. Unions oftentimes are very well paid and well resourced, but also beyond that, if you have the potential of gains, you will just sue anyway. Back to my argument. Even if you buy none of what I've said earlier, the fact that you don't outsource and have to pay each employee more just means you raise the cost of each individual employee, meaning you can just hire fewer people, because that's how the economy works, right? Like if you increase like the cost, the graph goes to the left, etc. Basic economics, right? So just increasing the wage of workers, even in outsourcing companies, means that these companies can just hire fewer workers, thus decreasing the jobs available overall. How do you weigh this contribution to the round? Why is OO out? Opening opposition is out because of killer lines from government bench, which they just never responded to. Number one, TJ actually had a killer line when he pointed out that oftentimes in outsourcing firms, in outside of the house, these workers are not able to unionize anyway, so it's not a counterfactual between unionizing against your smaller outsourcing firm versus a big, large employee. It's just no unionization versus some amount of unionization. Clearly, this debate is not about workers in that regard then. But also, as CG points out, it is clearly possible for these firms to sue all of your smaller employers if it is preferable for them to do so rather than leaving a lawsuit against the large and powerful employer. Clearly, then, this is not about those worker rights. But our impacts are just much, much larger, because economic competitiveness is a prerequisite to having a job to begin with, which is a prerequisite to having a good paying job. So clearly, yes, we agree that unfortunately workers will be kind of screwed outside. But if the counterfactual is other companies being able to perform better and therefore take away your job, that's far worse. But more than that, other companies taking over jobs and growing necessarily has extraneous harms. Things like, number one, cementing monopolies in the region, the point at which Taiwan and China are able to consolidate like their dominance over the microchip and AI sectors. Things like screwing over consumers because you no longer have innovation and competitiveness and prices going down. Things like destroying jobs altogether, which is necessarily a bigger impact than having jobs be slightly better paid. All of these means CEO take a first. Thank you.
Thanking the member of opposition for that speech, calling upon the government to speak whenever you're ready.
There's like a typhoon right now. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, I'll just try to speak loudly because the rain is so hard. Yeah. You can keep your camera. I'll take a POI from both opening and closing. CEO wants to prove why this decreases mergers and acquisitions and outsourcing. How do they prove this? One, they say corporations need to compete internationally. This is not as urgent now because Samsung is already really big. At worst, if we concede it, it stops only future acquisitions from happening. But second, it is premised on all of the actions that a corporation is taking being a basis for disputes. Workers will definitely not want to sue willy-nilly. They are unable to do this in the first place because unions have limited resources. They're likely going to choose this in the cases where the unions are directly affected by these things. So if there's a merger that helps the unions, that's completely fine. They will not sue for this. It's basic behavior. Secondly, this concedes a lot of the success rate of the disputes in the first place because for their harm to work, these disputes need to be in the favor of these unions. So all of our benefits are worth this trade-off insofar as the threat of that victory happening in the first place, which CEO concedes, is something that allows companies to proactively make sure that strikes don't happen in the first place, that their outsourcing does not directly harm their bottom line. But next, they say outsourcing is important for immigration and capital. So if this is true, they won't sue this if the outsourcing is done ethically, which means that now there are a lot of famous instances where it's not. So we're completely okay with suing this because if it prevents a lot of things like a lot of sweatshop workers from continuously being harmed with no repercussions, if the South Korean workers are able to represent them, that is something that is good. But the next thing that they say is that workers lack knowledge and will likely sue willy-nilly. This is not true because it's easy to understand if you need outside help or if you need a merger acquisition to take place or if you need certain outsourced goods if you cannot get your own goods from South Korea. This is simply true because South Korean workers know where their resources come from and it's obviously they know when they obviously cannot access this. So this is a flip, right? If there's a very good beneficial merge that is likely to take place or an outsourcing that is likely to take place, unions are likely to know about this for a few external reasons that Miranda was able to imply. One is that unions have a lot of knowledge. They likely have stakeholders or spokespersons who are very intricately intertwined in the knowledge of how to do this, but also that workers are just pretty smart and smarter than what Ian puts on. But the next thing they say is that workers strike before negotiations are done. This is not true. Striking is pretty hard in of itself. You lose your income, you lose the direct things that you're able to get. So unions are pretty rational about this and they don't want to lose a lot of the things or sacrifice a lot of the things. So yes, we embolden workers, but not to the point of making them stupid. But I want to be very engaging. It's honestly pretty good if they just want to sue for more money. They're obviously suing because their current income is low. They can't support their family. South Korea is getting more and more expensive. So they're likely going to do this rationally. It's also good for their economy if the wages increase because you have a lot of circular economy. More people are able to get purchasing power if they have higher wages. And we take money away from chaebols and their profit margins, which is good because they usually just buy yachts or whatever. But I want to outweigh all of this. The economy of South Korea continuing to be prosperous does not matter as much as workers' rights, simply because workers produce all of the value that South Korea has been able to centralize in the first place. But they are harmed continuously in status quo, and I don't think closing opposition has an answer for this. The next thing I want to do is position my extension. There's a few problems with OG. One, they work within the part of the debate about the gig economy corporations. Do we think that there are still large impacts to be had in old traditional corporations and monopolies that I think closing opposition is also working towards? But also it's unengaging to the behavior of workers as pointed out by Ardu, but also, even on their second push, it is unnuanced in South Korea. The principle relies on justice happening as well. So how do we take it over them? One, we localize it to how monopolies work in status quo or in South Korea, that it is top-heavy decision-making, that there are unclear targets when you have this disputes, and it is likely for these cycles to repeat, meaning that there's also things like corporate lobbying. So our burden is smaller. It's not full economic justice, but the ability to have a higher power over these chaebols. But we discussed, secondly, the first step to OG's benefits, that workers file these disputes in the first place because they are directly affected, and that things like resource pooling of unions can afford things like legal funds. But how does our material weigh over the principle of liability and more protests? We answer the OO burden of success by placing the win condition away from victories towards important changes of behavior in the 6 months of both the companies and workers, because there's a current underreporting of labor violations in status quo that disempowers people. So we deal with company behavior how, right? We explain that companies don't want strikes to happen in the first place, meaning they're likely to change their structure preemptively to appease workers. They're likely going to stop illegal outsourcing mechanisms, meaning, and this is all because this is easier to do so versus waiting for a strike or a dispute to happen. What else did we say? One, that this 6-month window is important, that actors can prepare for this, and this is important because it deals with a lot of the opposition concerns about things like outsourcing completely stopping, because they can just change the ways in which they outsource in order for it to be better. Sure, they might sacrifice short-term profits that are made exponentially, but that's completely fine because short-term profits just go to yachts. Second thing we said, proximate lawsuits are pretty much useless because they aren't addressing the roots of the problems, because the parent company policy is the root of the problem, and it is likely that even if there's a suing, it's going to be a temporary fix. But restructuring or outsourcing oftentimes directly affects workers. This is a lot of what Ian engages with. We fix this by corporations not choosing cheaper but riskier producers, and instead ones that are less prone to lawsuits. Before I respond to OO, I'll take a QI from CEO.
Hello. So, assuming but not conceding that your workers are omniscient and they always ask for things perfectly, you don't have to buy that all our demands are inappropriate. Increasing wages minimally means that you're less competitive versus other firms, meaning investors and consumers don't want to pick you when purchasing or investing.
I don't think that's true. Like, why are you, like, you'll be more competitive if you have higher wages. Anyway, OO says you are forced to fight the parent company. No, you only get the option to. And unions choosing to do this means they're probably capable, and it is a great opportunity for them to get victories. But why is it good to have this option? Because you have a constant threat of disputes. Because parent companies have many, many unions that can form coalitions and are likely to do so, especially with the safety net of not being able to be sued for financial damage. So you ought to weigh this on the autonomy you give workers to take larger battles and have a higher chance for larger victories. They say then that corps get to lay off workers to cut costs. This is how you actually get labor disputes, because restructuring involves massive layoffs, and we have the fiat to assume that this is a basis for disputes. So you lessen this on our side, because lawsuits are more costly than sacrificing profit, so they're not likely to lay off a lot of workers. Next thing they say is that it's easier to hold local contractors and managers accountable. I want to flip this. Smaller managers often have incentive to keep their jobs because they're more replaceable. So conceding reforms may get you fired by the parent company, meaning it's harder for your workers, you're harsher to your workers, you're likely to union bust. You have to weigh this, that our side, you threaten the involvement of the parent company, so parent companies are likely to accept more local concessions. Let's assume then, but not concede, that subcontractors centralize power, and this is a threat. Unions will also do this because it's seen as a threat, right? Why is this conflict good? One, more visibility for the century, or for the country. Meaning there's a long labor rights problem of South Korea that gets put into visibility. But next is that it moves the Overton window, meaning it's easier to support unions. But lastly, it pushes local governments in South Korea to concede. So for example, Jeju's fishermen are able to access what they demand. So it's okay if things get crazier, but like the status quo for workers is already crazy because they are paid really badly. Let's weigh everything through analyzing how these labor lawsuits work. Lastly, I think it heavily depends on the volume of evidence. We're able to provide a higher volume of evidence because there are more instances that you can sue in. I think this is really good, and it's able to take us to the debate. Probably closing with, but honestly, I don't know. Thank you.
Thanking government speaker for that speech, calling upon the opposition whip speaker to conclude the round.
Hi, just give me a moment to get water.
You're thinking of the preamble.
I have one.
Preamble is great. It's called in hand.
Now, I know that thus far, GovBench has talked about the harms to vulnerable workers, and in comparison, what Ian says about the slowing of growth or reduction in FDI just sounds deeply unsympathetic and abstract, but here's what that looks like to the everyday person. It looks like a subcontractor who loses his job because a firm halts production insofar as they are unable to outsource. It looks like a fresh graduate who can't find a job because firms refuse to expand and they only keep existing workers, and there's a reduction in competition. It looks like for an everyday individual when prices rise even though wages stagnate because the refusal to outsource makes everything more expensive than everyone. This is the everyday cost. It's an unseen cost, which is why it's no surprise that Lee Jae-myung's government, when he promoted and ran on the back of labor reforms on the midst of populist demand because of, well, like Korea's export growth dropping and global uncertainty with the tariffs and so forth, picked the most convenient, the most populist labor policy that did not cost his government anything but got him major symbolic victories. What I'm going to do in my speech is to explain why our counterfactual, i.e. the reduction in Korea's competitiveness, is the most important outcome in the debate and why consequently workers and individuals are treated significantly better on our side of the house. But first, I'm going to give responses to CG insofar as they explain that this is likely to be used well and they provide the new frame that this is just optional and therefore provides symbolic power to workers to be able to negotiate for better rights. The first thing I want to know is that I concede and acknowledge that this is a tool, but I think a tool also has perceptive power to two groups of individuals. The first is that this constitutes an unprecedented shift in reforms, which means it's a significant sign to local and foreign firms that there's increasing hostility towards FDI and corporations. Now, this is the type of thing that people who are looking for investments do because they do a lot of due diligence, and even the slightest change in regulatory considerations can be quite important in determining where they put their investment because they prioritize things like certainty. Korea often functions like a very structural system of chaebols insofar as we are telling foreign investors they may be held accountable for things they otherwise aren't accountable for. The question then rises, workers is, why don't I go to Hong Kong, or why don't I go to Singapore, or why don't I go to Japan, or why don't I go to China? Korea is not unique in the competitive advantage it provides, since all of these other countries are also in tech, which means the signaling effect, even with this otherwise small change, is particularly powerful. The second thing is what Ian mentions, which is already ahead of CG, where he explains that these types of things are often seen to be psychologically empowering workers. It comes accompanied by the populist rhetoric in the present climate of Korea. It gets people to act on it more. Workers feel like they should use it because they do have it. Ian explains to you really good analysis here when he says that even if negotiations occur and your boss tells you it's a last resort, the inherent power asymmetry means that there is a distrust, and you err on the side of caution and push for more and more and more, because you never really know if they're at their breaking point. Now, I know the response they give is to then say, but surely they have an incentive to want to allow it insofar as it's necessarily good for them. To this, I have 2 points of response. The reason why you ought buy our counterfactual more heavily is simply because of the fact that corporate restructuring or management outcomes to benefit the firm in the long term often do take a short run hit. So, for instance, things like outsourcing or mergers require people to lose jobs now for the company to expand, grow, and have more jobs in the future. But this is not something union members are necessarily going to prioritize, because inherently they're meant to stand for costs against them, which means none of these things are actually going to be beneficial for workers now, and they are unlikely to want to prioritize future workers for it. The second reason, and this is going to be a better reason that potentially breaks this deadlock, is to say that the people who lead unions are oftentimes the least compromising. They're people who are unwilling to say no. They're people who are unwilling to go to their base of supporters and say, hey, this is about future growth, because if there's future growth, more people might get jobs. They're going to be condemned for speaking the rhetoric of companies and sticking up for them, which means that even if these workers exist, they are quickly replaced into the long term. This mechanism is important and breaks this deadlock, because we don't just talk about unions as a silo. We explain why the people specifically leading that charge are prone to more one than the other, therefore breaking this clash in favor of CO over CG. I'm now going to do a piece of mitigation here to explain why workers are treated reasonably well, and this therefore is an overcorrection. Insofar as I do this, you outweigh Ian's arguments in the round higher, because he explains to you why the harms we're able to prevent from workers here is not as important as the harms that will accrue upon society in a world where corporations are allowed to be significantly less flexible. There are 3 reasons. The first is that, and these reasons are Korea-centric, which means these are characterizations you should significantly credit us for. The first is that there already are existing protections. Korea does have a minimum wage. They do have severance pay. There is unemployment insurance, and companies do provide healthcare. The reason for this is because in the developmental years of Korea, the government emphasized the family or caretaking role of chaebols. Insofar as you respected the hierarchy would also protect you and take care of you, which is the reason why these were a point of prestige for Korea and significantly pushed the industrial movement. The second one is to note that the unionization already exists simply by virtue of the motion. The motion concedes that unions exist and can go on strikes, but they amend their powers, which means there is the potential to this in status quo that union busing doesn't exist. These also already exist significantly in like automotive, shipping, or the transport industries, which is quite important because this proves that Gov gives these individuals significantly more leverage as opposed to solving the crisis of exploitation that they want to paint for you. The reason why you should weigh this in the round is because this is a positive contribution to the counterfactual insofar as we prove why it's not that bad. This is valuable mitigation because it shows the extent of obligation isn't so significant such that we need this extensive a reform. This is better than OO because OO actually doesn't provide a counterfactual. Their counterfactual was reliant on avoiding exacerbated harm, but their harms aren't harms that probably manifest for reasons that C, G, and OG already talk about, such as the fact that there is already a power asymmetry and GovBench probably kind of cracks that to a degree, and also the fact that their interpretation of the motion is odd. They go, like, this exists, so basically their interpretation exists only where you sue the big company and not the small company, but you're actually allowed to do both on both sides of the house, which is why this is important. Before I mechanize and illustrate to you why Ian's extension is the most important, I'll take closing.
You need to prove that outsourcing and merging is always going to result in labor disputes. Surely there's a threshold where unions choose only the worst forms of this, because unions have like limited amount of money and things like that.
Okay, so what I explained earlier is that we do things like reduce the calculus for unions in this regard. So for instance, that you cannot follow the law as much when you do on a strike, or you can do a more disruptive strike because it reduces your penalties for that. So it changes the calculus in a way that necessarily benefits them. The second thing I explained is the incentive of labor union leaders as so the populist climate, which significantly means this is likely to be misused because it adheres in the trade-off. Therefore, what Ian explains to you about why we need this for corporations to stay flexible is precisely because of the uncertain climate that we now see. Korea does have slowing growth and export shocks. Korea does have mounting debt. Korea does face global trade uncertainty insofar as they're an export-oriented industry. And this policy looks fantastic because in the face of it, it is a strong signal to workers that their rights should matter significantly more, but that was never a significant issue to begin with and one the government took care of anyways. What slowing growth looks like into the long term is Korea becoming significantly less competitive. This looks like reduction in the overall GDP of the country, which obviously doesn't sound as sensationalist, but it's important because it affects the government's ability to do things like pay out welfare, upskill or reskill workers to help them get through this climate. So while it provides a short-term solution, this is something that can't be rolled back, and it's likely to lock Korea into rigidity. So I agree with CG that it isn't about shocks, it's
Thanking the opposition whip speaker for that speech. With that, we come to the end of this round. Cool. I'll just start right with the call. It was a long cross debate for me. Closing up took a first, opening up took a second, closing up took a narrow third, opening up took an unfortunate fourth. CEO, OG, CG, OO. Cool. What is opening government's contribution in this round? Opening government has one simple contribution. Their contribution is that state owes a reciprocal duty towards its workers, especially these companies or enterprise. And the reason is simple. These workers are responsible for the productivity. They put in the blood and the sweat, and they make the output possible. Companies in return ought to give them the levers which makes work possible or which makes work safe. And they say that the state has the duty or state needs to enforce or protect these like this reciprocal obligation at any given point of time. Cool. And then they explain, obviously, why do these workers have no option but for the state to intervene. They explain these are desperate people who often don't have the capital and all those kinds of. So this is the broad principled push that comes from their side. What is Opening Op's contribution in this round? I think Opening Op has one simple contribution. Opening Op just says that your efforts to negotiate at the parent level are going to fail because they explain mechanisms like they are going to be intimidating in board meetings and the fact that they have no empathy because there's very little contact theory that's been in place. But B, and more importantly, the amount of change that you can get by prosecuting local companies far exceeds the amount of change that you can get by prosecuting parent companies. They explain a multitude of mechanisms here, like the overall cost to the factory being more than that to a parent company, the perceptive value of who is proximate to you and how that can help you, where do legal firms think they stand a chance. So it's conclusively proven that comparatively, it's easier to get concessions from these local subsidiaries, and it's rather likely to fail on the comparative. I think the first question that I ask myself in resolving top half is, does a law merit existence only when its utility can be proven or only when it works, or does a law also merit existence by virtue of the pure principle that it espouses or the pure value that it aims to endorse in society, which opening government claims to be equality or equity or whatever it is? I genuinely don't think any side gives a justification of what should be the criteria to assess whether laws should exist or not. So the first level of resolving this clash doesn't work out. What is the second level at which, because I think if that question was answered, then it would have been very easy to place one team over the other, because the contributions are quite segmented in that opening government argues that its mere existence is justified because of the value it espouses and endorses. Opening opposition says the law is only utile insofar as it can get some like comparatively more benefits than harms. I don't think either justification is given on the on what basis should laws be adjudicated. Then I come to the second level. Then I think on engagement, I think opening government wins. I think opening government is just able to point out the simple flaw in opening opposition case, that if it is true by virtue of what opening opposition says by their own analysis, that local players have more sympathy to you, overall cost to the factory is more legal support exists, then you will exercise that option first, and you are only likely to exercise the secondary option of suing the parents thereafter, because you recognize by opening opposition's own analysis of where you stand a better chance. I think this direct response from DPM is able to show to a large degree why people won't act in the way that opening opposition says they will act. But more importantly, I think the biggest burden missing in opening up, also as pointed by OG, is just when exists between prosecuting the subsidiary and the parent, you have to explain why people will always go for the bigger fish, that is the parent company. I think most of your analysis relies on that. Insofar you don't prove that frame, it becomes very difficult to credit any of your impacts. And I think this opening government call out is unfair. Then I think opening government is able to prove that most of OO's impacts don't occur because this just relies on this massive assumption that you straight away go for the big entity. When they're able to discredit those harms, I think there is enough value on opening government to show why this principally needs to exist, because it enforces the reciprocal duty that exists and it aims to close in the gap between the worker and the company and protect the most vulnerable workers by virtue of the character, like using the character they have at play. So that then becomes the tipping point towards OG for me over OO. Bringing in closing government. I think closing government has 3 attempts at making a contribution. So the first extension that they run is that now we will have more reporting. So here they explain why they will have more reporting. The first thing that they say is we will have more reporting because people often don't want to report people who are near and dear to them. That is to say, individuals that are proximate to them. And that is why you will have more reporting. And often you don't want to prosecute, like report those who you have a relationship with, like local subcontractor employer, because it will just create a sense of discomfort and lack of safety. I want to note the issue with this. This is just kind of conceding to opening up case, right? Because if it is true that it's very difficult for you to prosecute people at your proximate levels anyways, it is likely that you, what OO says is true, and it is likely that you end up going to these parent subsidiaries and prosecuting them. The thing is, I think this is a likely inference. I'm not saying this is something credited or this is something that is sufficiently called out in the round, but I just think that this, in and of itself, this problem setting proves nothing in the round. I don't think it either proves this impact that you have of more reporting, because that more reporting then needs to be explained to have some value. So we don't think that this really works as an extension material. What is the second thing that you then try to do? The second thing that you then try to do is say that it is done well. Here you say things like, you can consult with the local level leaders, the spokesperson, and yeah, there's a finite resource base that these unions have, and they're quite smart about the way that they want to go about using it. So sure, I think the value that we are able to derive from this extension in the round is just that these people are not going to go Hail Mary on it, and they're likely going to exercise some level of discretion on it. So I think this is the analysis which actually is able to resolve some degree of tension that comes in the first claim, because it is true that they are smart and they recognize the struggles that exist with going against a larger entity. Even though they are uncomfortable when prosecuting local entities, they are going to be very, very selective in terms of how they use it. So what they're able to draw as an implication is, worst case, we just, just sue less, we just strike less, which is still okay than striking incessantly and striking against the wrong target, which is the parent subsidiary, who obviously has much more power over you. So I think that's the first line of comparison on short cross then. I think even though CG kind of cuts into their own benefit when they claim that, okay, you just strike in lesser instances, I think what they're able to show that at least you don't strike against the wrong target, at least you don't go ahead and, just directly target the parent subsidiaries, because they're able to explain how spokesperson and other people on the ground have some kind of awareness about whether this battle is going to be worth it or not. So that also, I think, becomes a large reason why CG is able to place over OO. Firstly, what I just explained, even though they cut into their benefit, they're just able to explain why that selectiveness is good and why they have the capacity or the knowledge to make good decisions. And the second thing is, I think they're also able to explain just quite explicitly in response that the same thing, when there's a subcontractor that you can sue, it is very unlikely why you will go one step beyond it. So I think they're able to point out the massive comparative gap, like massive issue on OO, the assumption that they have, but also explain that just like striking less is far better of a comparative than striking against the wrong target. So this is sufficient to win against opening opposition. But the reason this is not sufficient to win against opening government is because it more or less draws to the same bottom line and is often reliant on that. What do I mean by this? So the first level of comparison that you make is that more reporting is good. But I just explained how more reporting is not the part that I credit, but rather selective reporting and reporting in good instances is the part that I credit. But the problem again is on Gov bench. I don't know whether a law should be warranted into existence only when it like gives utility or by virtue of the values it espouses. So I am not sure why I should value CG contribution of this law will be used well above OG contribution of this law should exist because it's good. The second weighing that comes from closing government is to say that there is a symbolic value because optionality now exists and that makes people empowered. I think this is more or less what OG says, that people are suffering, people are vulnerable, they just feel now more empowered. I don't think there is any degree of newness to this. So at the end of it, I think there's the same issue of what warrants a law into existence, utility or its inherent value, which CG doesn't answer. So I think like it's just then easier to default to OG when they say that this is just good because it protects the most vulnerable. So I weighed then OG over CG. CG had to answer that question in order for that contribution to be weighed over OG. Bringing in closing opposition, I think closing opposition has a simple case. Closing opposition just explains M&A and outsourcing are decisions that workers don't understand and in many instances rather act harshly towards, but these are important for their overall welfare, and that's why this law is bad. It limits abilities for corporations to actually perform welfare for workers. That is the broad claim coming at closing opposition. Why do they win over opening op? I think they fill the massive burden gap on like op bench. That is to say, why is it that workers are so naive, or why are workers going to use this in the harshest ways possible? Thus unlocking all of OO, which relies on the fact that you directly go for the top company, top entity, or whatever it is. They're able to explain a couple of things. A, the fact that they often have very short-term understanding. They can't just encapsulate, like envision the thing that in the long run they'll get benefits, even if right now they get offed from their job. The second thing is just they're able to explain how this has just rather empowered the movement that already existed. So it's just going to make matters worse, and it's going to bring on the heat on rather these cables itself. So it's just more difficult for them to make these decisions now. So I think that they're able to explain why this will be used in the worst ways possible, which is crucial framing in order to credit any off-bench impact of why this ends up hurting workers more. That is the reason that they're able to simply weigh over opening opposition. Why do they weigh over closing government? I think closing government has a couple of responses to them. The first response that CG tries to do is to say that M&A is already done to a large extent. You don't need more of these in the future. So the benefit is saturated. And the second thing that they say is that these people are smart and ethical, and they're not as dumb as CEO claims. So on the first response of M&As have been done to a satisfactory level, at best this mitigates CEO impact. I don't see how there is any material on CG that I ought to weigh over CEO or CEO's mitigated impact to credit you the win on this response then. So this mitigation doesn't serve much. But on the second thing of which eventually becomes the whiplash of how is this used as a tool, I think closing op is just able to much more thoroughly explain to me in multiple ways for why people are going to use this in incredibly short-sighted ways, psychologically, like being empowered, do not understand trade-offs, all of that. So they're able to explain that these harms actually end up occurring, and these harms actually end up impacting a lot of people. So that impact is much cleaner and clearly creditable in comparison to what CG has, which is an abstract understanding of a symbolic value that they unlock. Comparing against opening government then, on the principle that they have on OG, versus CO material. I think that CO is able to show the actual harm that happens to workers themselves. So I think that though versus other benches, it's unclear whether laws should exist on the basis of inherent values or utility. I think on CO, to a large extent, they show that even decisions taken towards the welfare of workers and their rights are now subdued or blocked. So they're able to flip OG's understanding of whether this law espouses good values for the workers themselves, and does this actually give them the protections that they need. So I think the first thing that CO is then able to do is just show that this law just doesn't have negative impacts, but also the fact that it limits the ability for corporations to do good for its workers. So it's just inherently a problematic idea. But the second thing is just that I think CO's harms apply to a large number of workers, probably all, versus the narrow number of workers that opening government is able to impact. So both on the question of the principle, whether it ought to exist or not, but also on the number of people impacted, I think CO is able to weigh OG out. That's the OA. Any questions?